Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I have been working as an emergency room nurse at Riverside General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, for 17 years. My name is Prudence. Most people find this name old-fashioned, but I have always thought it was a fitting name for someone who chooses to spend their nights and weekends witnessing people's most vulnerable moments. Over the years, I've seen who comes through the emergency room doors and what I've witnessed. Traffic accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, severe assaults, unimaginable accidents, and every kind of medical crisis that sends people rushing to the hospital day and night. Over time, these cases blend together, becoming ordinary parts of the never-ending cycle of pain and hope in emergency medicine. But there are some patients you never forget. They stay in your mind even after they leave the hospital, causing you to question everything you thought you knew about medicine, psychology, and human nature. The first patient I will never forget arrived about 3 years ago, on a cold Thursday night in October. That evening, the emergency room was strangely quiet, the kind of quiet experience nurses dislike, because we know it won't last. There were only a few people in the waiting room. All had come in with minor complaints. The trauma rooms were all empty. I was in the nurse's station dealing with paperwork when the triage nurse suddenly called on the internal line and said she was bringing someone in directly. The man brought to the emergency room that night appeared to be in his mid-40s. He was wearing what looked like an expensive navy suit, but it was wrinkled as if he hadn't taken it off in days. His hair was salt and pepper colored, neatly trimmed and well-groomed. He seemed like someone who cared about his appearance. Still, what struck me most was not his appearance, but the expression on his face. It carried a shadow of fear mixed with another emotion I couldn't quite name. It was the look of someone who had lost something important, but couldn't remember what it was. "This is Cornelius," said the triage nurse, directing the man to one of the examination rooms. "He says he remembers nothing except his own name." I had encountered cases of memory loss before. They are not as common as they appear on television shows, but they do happen. Most often, it's temporary memory loss following head trauma or dissociative amnesia triggered by severe psychological stress. The protocol is simple: rule out head trauma, perform basic neurological tests, order a CT scan if necessary, and wait for the memory to return on its own. Most of the time, the memory slowly returns within a few hours or a few days. I entered the examination room with my standard professional smile, the one designed to put patients at ease while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Cornelius was sitting on the examination bed, his hands folded in his lap, his posture rigid with tension. Up close, I could see that his suit, while expensive, had small stains on the lapel that looked like dried blood. His shoes were scuffed, and there was dirt under his fingernails that seemed at odds with his otherwise immaculate appearance. "Hello, Cornelius," I said, pulling up the rolling stool. "I'm Prudence, your nurse tonight. Can you tell me what brought you to the emergency room?" He looked at me with those confused eyes, and I noticed they were an unusual color, somewhere between green and gray, like the ocean before a storm. "I don't know," he said, his voice cultured and precise despite his apparent confusion. "I was walking down Morrison Street and suddenly I realized I didn't know where I was going. I couldn't remember where I lived, where I worked, or even my last name. The only thing I know is that my name is Cornelius." "When did this start?" I asked, pulling on gloves to begin my initial examination. I'm not sure. Maybe an hour ago, maybe longer. Time feels strange right now, like it's moving too fast and too slow at the same time. He paused, then added something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I feel like I'm supposed to be somewhere important, doing something crucial, but I can't remember what. I started with the basics, checking his pupils for signs of concussion, looking for any obvious head injuries, testing his reflexes and coordination. Everything appeared normal. His vital signs were slightly elevated, consistent with anxiety, but nothing alarming. There were no signs of drug use or alcohol intoxication. The blood on his lapel wasn't his. I couldn't find any injuries that would explain it. Cornelius, do you have any identification on you? A wallet, phone, anything that might help us figure out who to contact? He shook his head. I checked my pockets in the waiting room. Nothing. It's like I appeared out of nowhere. He said this with a strange half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Thaddeus arrived about 20 minutes later. Thaddeus was one of our most experienced emergency physicians, a tall, thin man in his 60s who had seen everything there was to see in emergency medicine. He had a particular interest in psychiatric emergencies and unusual presentations, which made him the perfect physician for this case. "Good evening, Cornelius," Thaddeus said in his distinctive deep voice. "I'm Dr. Thaddeus. Nurse Prudence has filled me in on your situation. Let's see if we can help you figure out what's happening." Thaddeus conducted a thorough neurological examination, testing everything from basic motor functions to complex cognitive processes. Cornelius passed every test perfectly. His memory for general information was intact. He knew the current president could perform mathematical calculations, could name objects and describe their functions. It was only personal information that was missing, as if someone had carefully erased every detail that could identify who he was while leaving everything else untouched. "We're going to run some tests," Thaddeus explained. "Blood work to check for any substances that might affect memory, a CT scan to look for any brain injuries or abnormalities. In the meantime, I'd like you to try to relax. These types of memory issues are usually temporary. As I drew blood for the lab work, I noticed Cornelius watching me with an intensity that was slightly unnerving. "You seem familiar," he said suddenly. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so," I replied, though something about him did seem vaguely familiar, like someone you might have passed on the street or seen in a coffee shop. "Portland's not that big, though. We might have crossed paths." "Maybe," he said, but he continued to stare at me with that intense focus. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like the person you think you are isn't really who you are at all?" It was an odd question, philosophical in a way that seemed out of place in an emergency room. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," I said carefully. "Identity can be complicated." "No," he said, shaking his head emphatically. "I mean really living someone else's life, wearing their face, using their name, walking in their shoes. What if memory isn't just about forgetting? What if it's about remembering things that aren't really yours to remember?" Before I could respond, Thaddeus returned with a police officer. "Cornelius, this is Officer Bradley. We've asked him to run your fingerprints, see if we can identify you that way. Is that okay?" Cornelius hesitated, then nodded slowly. As the officer took his prints using a mobile scanner, I noticed Cornelius's hands were trembling slightly. The results would take about an hour to come back, so we proceeded with the CT scan while we waited. The radiology tech wheeled Cornelius away, and I took the opportunity to discuss the case with Thaddeus. "What do you think?" I asked. Thaddeus frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The presentation is unusual. Most amnesia patients have some fragments of memory, some sense of self even if the details are missing. This complete erasure of personal identity while maintaining all other cognitive functions, it's almost too perfect. You think he's faking? I'm not sure. His affect seems genuine, and you can't fake pupil responses and other physiological signs of stress. But something about this case feels off. The blood on his clothes, the complete absence of any identification, the philosophical musings about identity. It's like he's playing a role, even if he doesn't know he's playing it. The CT scan came back normal. No brain injuries, no tumors, no signs of stroke or any other neurological event that would explain the memory loss. The blood work was still processing, but initial results showed no drugs or toxins. Medically speaking, there was no reason for Cornelius to have lost his memory. It was close to midnight when Officer Bradley returned with the fingerprint results, and what he told us made the case even stranger. The prints don't match anyone in our system, he said, looking puzzled. No criminal record, no government employment, no military service, nothing. It's like this guy doesn't exist. But that wasn't the strangest part. However, Bradley continued, we did get a hit on the blood on his clothing. It belongs to a man named Marcus Wellington, reported missing 3 days ago. His family said he left for work Monday morning and never came home. I felt a chill run down my spine. Is Marcus Wellington dead? We don't know. We haven't found a body, but given the amount of blood on your patient's clothes, it's not looking good. Bradley turned to look through the window into Cornelius's room. I'm going to need to ask him some questions. When we returned to the room, Cornelius was sitting up in bed, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. He looked up when we entered, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something flash across his face. Not confusion or fear, but something else. Satisfaction, maybe, or anticipation. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd seen anything at all. Cornelius, Officer Bradley said, I need to ask you about the blood on your clothing. Cornelius looked down at the stains on his lapel, touching them gently with one finger. Blood? He said, his voice distant. I didn't notice. Whose blood is it? That's what we're trying to figure out. Do you remember anything about how it got there? Any fragments of memory? Even something that doesn't make sense? Cornelius closed his eyes, his face contorting with apparent effort. There's a room with white walls, the sound of water dripping, someone crying, begging, but I don't know if it's a memory or a dream or something I saw in a movie. It doesn't feel real. Over the next several hours, Cornelius provided fragments of what might have been memories or might have been fabrications. He described a house he couldn't locate, a job he couldn't name, people he couldn't identify. Each detail was vivid but disconnected, like pieces from different puzzles forced together. The more he talked, the more unsettled I became. There was something about the way he spoke, the careful precision of his words, the way he watched our reactions to gauge what he should say next. It reminded me of someone, but I couldn't place who. And then, there were the things he knew that he shouldn't know if his amnesia was real. He knew my shift schedule, mentioning that I must be tired working another double. He knew that Thaddeus had a daughter who was a surgeon, something that wasn't common knowledge. He knew that Officer Bradley was new to the force, having transferred from Seattle just 2 months ago. When I confronted him about this knowledge, Cornelius looked genuinely confused. I don't know how I know these things, he said. They're just there in my head, like facts I've always known. Is that strange? Thaddeus decided to try a different approach. He brought in a psychiatric consultant, Dr. Sarah Hendricks, who specialized in dissociative disorders. She spent 2 hours with Cornelius, using various techniques to try to unlock his memories. But the more she probed, the more agitated Cornelius became. "You're trying to make me remember things that aren't mine to remember," he said at one point, his voice rising with frustration. "Don't you understand? Cornelius is just a name, a placeholder. The real question isn't who I am, but who I was before I became who I am." It was circular logic that made no sense, but Cornelius seemed completely convinced of its truth. He began to pace the small examination room, his movements becoming increasingly erratic. "You want to know about the blood? Fine. Marcus Wellington was a bad man who did bad things to good people. He needed to be stopped, but I didn't stop him. Someone else did, someone who doesn't exist anymore." "Are you saying you killed Marcus Wellington?" Officer Bradley asked, his hand moving subtly toward his radio. Cornelius laughed, a sound that was completely devoid of humor. "How can I kill someone when I don't even exist? When I can't remember being anyone at all? You're asking the wrong questions." The situation was escalating, and I could see Thaddeus preparing to order sedation if necessary. But then Cornelius did something that changed everything. He walked over to the small mirror on the wall and stared at his reflection for a long moment. Then he turned to me and said, very clearly and calmly, "Prudence, you need to check the basement of 4782 Northeast Hancock Street. You need to go now." "How do you know my name?" Bradley asked, suddenly alert. "We never told you Nurse Prudence's full name." But Cornelius wasn't listening. He was still staring at me with those storm-colored eyes. "The basement," he repeated. "Before it's too late." Officer Bradley made the call, and within an hour, we had our answer. In the basement of the abandoned house on Hancock Street, police found Marcus Wellington. He was alive, but barely, having been held captive for 3 days without food or water. He had been tortured, though he was too traumatized to say by whom. The basement matched Cornelius's description perfectly. White walls, dripping water from a leaky pipe. The exact scene he had described as a fragment of memory. But here's where the story becomes truly inexplicable. Security footage from the area showed Marcus Wellington entering the house on Monday morning, apparently of his own free will. No one else was seen entering or leaving until the police arrived. Marcus himself had no memory of how he got there, or who had hurt him. He didn't recognize Cornelius when shown a photograph. The torture implements found in the basement had no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, nothing to connect them to anyone. Cornelius, meanwhile, had begun to change. As the night wore on, his personality seemed to shift and fracture. Sometimes he was the confused amnesiac we'd first met. Sometimes he was cold and calculating, describing in clinical detail medical procedures he shouldn't know. Sometimes he was childlike, crying and asking for his mother. And sometimes, most disturbingly, he was completely lucid, talking about his life as Cornelius as if it were a role he had chosen to play. "You want to know the truth," he said to me during one of his lucid moments, just as the sun was beginning to rise. "The truth is that memory is just a story we tell ourselves about who we are. Change the story, change the person. Erase the story, erase the person. But what happens when someone else starts writing your story? What happens when the memories in your head belong to someone who never existed?" I was exhausted by this point, having been on duty for nearly 20 hours. But something about what he said resonated with a deep unease I'd been feeling all night. "Cornelius," I said carefully, "are you saying someone implanted false memories in your mind?" He smiled, that same strange half-smile from when he'd first arrived. I'm saying that Cornelius walked into this hospital tonight, and Cornelius will walk out. But the man who was here before Cornelius, he's gone, erased, overwritten, like deleting a file and saving a new one with the same name. That's not possible, Thaddeus interjected. Memory doesn't work that way. You can't just erase a personality and install a new one. Can't you? Cornelius asked. How would you know? If it was done perfectly, if every trace of the original was removed and replaced, how would anyone ever know? The body remains the same, the brain remains the same, but the person is just information, and information can be edited. The blood work finally came back with one unusual finding: traces of an experimental compound that wasn't in any standard database. Thaddeus had to call a friend at the CDC to identify it. It was a psychoactive substance being researched for treating severe PTSD, designed to help patients dissociate from traumatic memories. But the levels in Cornelius's blood were far higher than any therapeutic dose, high enough to cause significant neurological effects. Who gave you this drug? Thaddeus asked. This isn't something you can get on the street. This is cutting-edge pharmaceutical research. Cornelius shook his head. I don't remember taking anything. But then again, I don't remember anything, do I? Maybe someone wanted me to forget. Or maybe someone wanted Cornelius to exist. The police wanted to hold him for questioning about Marcus Wellington, but they had no evidence connecting him to the crime beyond the blood on his clothes and his knowledge of the location. Marcus himself couldn't identify his attacker, and there was no physical evidence linking Cornelius to the scene. The district attorney declined to press charges, citing insufficient evidence. Social services tried to find placement for him, but without any identity or history, it was complicated. He had no insurance, no known address, no family to contact. He was a ghost in the system, existing only in the present moment with no past and no clear future. During his last hours in the ER, while we waited for social services to figure out what to do with him, Cornelius became increasingly agitated. He kept insisting that someone was coming for him, that his real life was about to begin. He talked about memories that hadn't happened yet, describing future events as if they were past experiences. Next Tuesday, there will be another one, he told me. Another person who isn't who they think they are. And then another the Tuesday after that. We're all being rewritten, one by one. The question is, are we being saved or replaced? I tried to get more information from him, but his responses became increasingly incoherent. He started mixing up pronouns, referring to himself as we and they, talking about Cornelius in the third person as if observing himself from the outside. It was like watching someone's sense of self dissolve in real time. The last coherent thing he said to me was just before social services arrived to transfer him to a psychiatric facility for observation. He grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. Check your own memories, Prudence, he said urgently. Make sure they're really yours. Make sure you're really you. Because once you start questioning, once you really start examining the story you tell yourself about who you are, you might find that some chapters were written by someone else. He was transferred to the state psychiatric hospital that afternoon. I called to check on him a week later, only to be told that no patient named Cornelius had ever been admitted. When I insisted, describing him in detail and providing the date and time of transfer, the administrator checked again. The records showed that the transport van had arrived empty. The drivers insisted they had delivered a patient, but they couldn't remember any details about him. It was as if Cornelius had simply ceased to exist the moment he left our hospital. I tried to follow up on Marcus Wellington, but he had disappeared too. his family said he came home from the hospital, packed a bag, and left without explanation. They received a text saying he was safe, but needed time alone. The police closed the case, citing lack of evidence and no complaint from the victim. But the strangest part came 3 weeks later. I was working another night shift when I noticed something odd in our computer system. There was a patient file for someone named Cornelius, dated from 3 years before the night he came to our ER. According to the file, this earlier Cornelius had presented with identical symptoms: complete amnesia with intact cognitive function, traces of the same experimental drug in his system. The attending physician's notes were thorough and detailed, describing the same philosophical musings about identity and memory, the same fragments of impossible memories, the same unsettling intensity. But here's the thing. The attending physician listed on that file was me. The notes were in my writing style, using my typical phrases and medical abbreviations. But I had no memory of this patient. I checked my personal records, my calendar from that time, even called colleagues who had worked with me that night. No one remembered this case. I printed out the file and took it to Thaddeus. He read it carefully, then looked at me with concern. "Prudence, this is definitely your charting style, but look at the date. You were on vacation that week. I remember because I had to cover your shifts. You were in Hawaii with your sister." He was right. I pulled up my phone and found the photos from that trip, complete with timestamps proving I had been thousands of miles away when this patient was supposedly treated. Yet the computer showed me logged in, working, charting on a patient I had never seen. We checked the security footage from that night 3 years ago, but the files had been corrupted, showing only static during the relevant hours. We tried to trace the origin of the file in the computer system, but it seemed to have always been there, as if it had been part of our database from the beginning. Thaddeus wanted to report it to hospital administration, but I convinced him to wait. I needed to understand what was happening first. I started researching the experimental drug found in Cornelius's system, reaching out to colleagues in pharmaceutical research. What I learned was disturbing. The compound was being developed by a company called Mnemonic Pharmaceuticals, ostensibly for treating severe trauma. But rumors in the research community suggested darker applications. There were whispers about experiments in memory modification, in creating blank slate subjects who could be programmed with new identities. The company had ties to intelligence agencies, to private military contractors, to organizations that operated in the shadows between legal and illegal. I tried to contact Mnemonic Pharmaceuticals directly, but the company seemed to have vanished. Their website was gone, their phone numbers disconnected, their offices empty. Former employees I tracked down claimed to have no memory of working there, though their resumes clearly listed the company. It was as if the entire organization had been erased from existence, leaving only traces and whispers. One former researcher who would only speak to me anonymously told me something that still keeps me awake at night. The drug wasn't just about erasing memories, she said. It was about creating them, implanting fully formed identities into subjects, complete with histories, preferences, skills they never learned. But there was a problem. The original personality didn't always stay suppressed. Sometimes it would resurface, creating a war inside the subject's mind between who they were and who they had been made to be. She described test subjects who developed multiple personalities, each one claiming to be the real person. Subjects who remembered lives they had never lived, who possessed knowledge they had never learned, and most disturbingly, subjects who could somehow transfer their manufactured memories to others, spreading their false identities like a virus. "We had to shut it down," she said. "Some of the subjects escaped before we could neutralize the effects." We don't know how many are out there, living lives that aren't really theirs, spreading their condition to others. Every person they interact with extensively becomes a potential vector for memory contamination. I thought about Cornelius's words. Check your own memories, Prudence. Make sure they're really yours. Since that night, I've noticed things. Small inconsistencies in my own memories. Moments that don't quite fit. Knowledge I possess but don't remember acquiring. I know things about people I've never met. Remember conversations that couldn't have happened. Sometimes I catch myself responding to a name that isn't mine, or reaching for objects in places I've never been. I've started keeping a detailed journal, documenting everything I experience, trying to establish a baseline of what's real. But even as I write, I wonder, are these my words, or am I writing someone else's story? Am I Prudence, the ER nurse who encountered a strange patient named Cornelius? Or am I someone else, programmed to believe I'm Prudence, living out a narrative that was written for me? The other nurses have noticed changes in me. They say I sometimes speak in a different voice, use medical terminology I shouldn't know, reference cases I never worked on. There are hours I can't account for, shifts I don't remember working, patients I've apparently treated but have no memory of. Last week, I found a note in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing. The original, Prudence, is gone. I am the replacement. But who will replace me? I've considered seeking psychiatric help, but I'm afraid of what they might find, or worse, I'm afraid they might be part of it, whoever they are. The researchers, the company, the shadowy organizations that turned memory into a weapon and identity into a commodity. Thaddeus has been watching me with increasing concern. Yesterday, he pulled me aside and said, "Prudence, you're not yourself lately. Maybe you should take some time off." But the way he said it, the emphasis on yourself, made me wonder if he knows something. Or maybe he's been affected too. Maybe none of us are who we think we are anymore. I still work in the ER, still treat patients, still go through the motions of being Prudence. But every new patient who comes in with confusion, with memory problems, with questions about identity, makes me wonder if they're another Cornelius. Another person caught between who they were and who they've been made to be. Sometimes, late at night during quiet shifts, I stand in front of the same mirror where Cornelius stared at his reflection, and I ask myself the question he posed. What happens when someone else starts writing your story? I study my face, looking for signs that it's really mine, that the thoughts behind it originate from my own brain rather than from someone else's design. 3 months ago, a woman came into the ER with amnesia. She knew only her first name, Prudence. She had my face, my voice, my medical knowledge. But she insisted she had never been a nurse, had never worked in a hospital. When I showed her a mirror, she screamed and said, "That's not me. That's someone else wearing my face." Security footage shows me working alone that night, talking to an empty room, having a conversation with no one. My colleagues say there was never another Prudence, that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. But I remember her. I remember the terror in her eyes that were exactly like mine, as she realized that one of us wasn't real. She disappeared from the hospital the same way Cornelius did, leaving no trace except in my memory. Or maybe she never existed at all. Maybe she was a glitch in my programming, a glimpse of the original Prudence trying to reclaim her life. Or maybe I'm the glitch, and somewhere out there the real Prudence is living her life, unaware that a copy exists. The search for Cornelius led nowhere. Every lead ended in confusion, corrupted data, or people with suspicious gaps in their memories. But last month I received an anonymous package at my apartment. Inside was a single photograph. Me, standing next to Cornelius, both of us smiling at the camera. The photo was dated from 5 years ago, 2 years before the night he came to the ER. I have no memory of taking this photo, no memory of knowing Cornelius before that night. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Remember who you really are." But that's the problem. I don't know who I really am anymore. Am I Prudence, the ER nurse with 17 years of experience? Am I someone else living under an assumed identity? Am I a test subject who escaped from an experiment I don't remember? Or am I something else entirely? Something that never existed until someone decided I should. All I know is that Cornelius was right about one thing. Once you start questioning your memories, once you really examine the story you tell yourself about who you are, you can never be certain of anything again. Every memory becomes suspect, every relationship questionable, every aspect of your identity potentially false. I continue to work, continue to treat patients, continue to live as Prudence, but I also continue to investigate, to search for answers about mnemonic pharmaceuticals, about the experimental drug, about the people who may or may not be who they claim to be. I've found others like me, medical professionals with unexplained knowledge, missing time, and memories that don't quite fit. We meet in secret, compare notes, try to piece together what's happening to us. Some believe we're victims of a government experiment gone wrong. Others think we're soldiers in a war we don't remember signing up for. Sleeper agents waiting for activation. A few insist we're the lucky ones, that we've been upgraded, given enhanced abilities and knowledge through artificial memories. But most of us just want to know the truth. Are we who we think we are, or are we someone else's creation? The hospital administration has noticed the irregularities in our system, the phantom patients, the impossible records, the staff members who sometimes seem to be different people. They've brought in consultants, upgraded security, implemented new verification protocols, but the anomalies continue. New cases of amnesia arrive regularly, all with the same pattern. Intact cognitive function, traces of unknown drugs, and questions about identity that have no answers. I've started to recognize them when they come in, these lost souls caught between identities. They all have the same look in their eyes that Cornelius had, that combination of confusion and hidden knowledge, of being both lost and exactly where they're supposed to be. I try to help them, but I don't know if I'm treating patients or fellow victims. I don't know if I'm healing them or spreading whatever condition we all share. Sometimes I wonder if Cornelius was patient zero, the first of whatever we've become. Or maybe he was just another link in a chain that stretches back further than any of us realize. Maybe this has been happening for years, decades even, with people being replaced, rewritten, reformed into new versions of themselves without anyone noticing. The most terrifying possibility is that this is normal, that identity has always been this fluid, this uncertain, that we've all always been vulnerable to having our memories edited, our personalities overwritten, our entire sense of self replaced by someone else's design. Maybe Cornelius didn't bring a disease to our hospital. Maybe he just revealed a truth we'd all been programmed to ignore. I think about Marcus Wellington sometimes, the man whose blood was on Cornelius's clothes. Did he escape from his basement prison only to become a prisoner of a different kind, trapped in an identity that might not be his own? Or was the man in the basement the copy, and the real Marcus Wellington was the one who walked away? These are the questions that haunt me during long shifts, that follow me home to my apartment where I live alone, because I can't trust anyone enough to let them close. Every relationship feels like a potential trap. Every intimate moment a possible invasion of my already compromised identity. How can you love someone when you're not sure who you are? How can you trust someone else when you can't trust your own memories? I've considered leaving, disappearing like Cornelius did, starting fresh somewhere with a new name and a new life. But would that be escaping or just accepting the program? Would I be reclaiming my identity or just exchanging one false self for another? So I stay, I work, I investigate, and I wait. I wait for Cornelius to return, though I'm not sure I'd recognize him if he did. He could be anyone now, wearing any face, living any life. He could be one of my colleagues, one of my patients, even someone I pass on the street without knowing. Or he could be me, and I wouldn't even know it. The emergency room is the perfect place for someone in my condition. It's a liminal space where people come in crisis, where identities are reduced to symptoms and treatments, where the only thing that matters is the immediate present. Here, I can function without a past, without certainty about who I am. Here, I am simply Prudence, the nurse, treating patients who may or may not be who they claim to be. But late at night, when the ER is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I remember Cornelius's words about memory being just a story we tell ourselves. I think about all the stories I tell myself about my childhood, my training, my years of experience. Are they my stories, or were they written for me? Am I the author of my own life, or just a character in someone else's narrative? The truth is, I may never know. The evidence has been too well hidden, the tracks too carefully covered. Whoever is behind this, if anyone is, has made sure that questioning reality itself becomes the only reality we can trust. We are all Cornelius now, all uncertain about our identities, all living lives that may or may not be our own. But I continue to document everything, continue to gather evidence, continue to hope that someday the truth will emerge. That someday I'll know whether I'm really Prudence or just someone programmed to believe I am. Until then, I exist in a state of perpetual uncertainty, treating patients who might be victims or perpetrators, working alongside colleagues who might be originals or replacements, living a life that might be mine or might belong to someone who never existed. This is my story, or at least the story I remember. Whether it's true, whether it's mine, whether any of it really happened the way I remember it, I can no longer say with certainty. All I know is that somewhere out there, Cornelius is living his life, whatever life that might be, carrying secrets about identity and memory that could shatter our understanding of what it means to be human. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the boundary between sleep and waking blurs, I swear I can feel him watching me through my own eyes, as if he never really left, as if he's been here all along, waiting patiently for the moment when Prudence finally disappears and someone else takes her place. The only question is, has that moment already passed, and I just don't remember it? My name is Temperance, and I've been working as an emergency room nurse at St. Augustine Medical Center in Salem, Massachusetts, for the past 14 years. In all that time, through all the traumas and crises and medical emergencies I've witnessed, nothing prepared me for the patient I'm about to tell you about. This case haunted me so deeply that I had to take a 3-month leave of absence afterward. And even now, 2 years later, I still wake up some nights thinking about what I saw, what I couldn't prevent, and what I still don't understand. It was a Tuesday night in November, around 11 p.m. when they brought him in. The paramedics had already radioed ahead with the basics. Male patient, early 30s, multiple self-inflicted lacerations on his arms and torso, conscious but uncooperative. We get self-harm cases regularly in the ER, unfortunately. Usually, they're people in crisis, dealing with depression, trauma, or other mental health issues. We stabilize them medically, get psychiatry involved, and try to connect them with the help they need. It's heartbreaking, but routine. This case was different from the moment he arrived. The patient's name was Ezekiel, and he was brought in on a stretcher, his arms and chest wrapped in blood-soaked bandages that the paramedics had hastily applied. What struck me immediately wasn't the injuries themselves, but his demeanor. Most self-harm patients I've treated are either deeply distressed, withdrawn, or sometimes agitated and combative. Ezekiel was none of these things. He was calm, almost serene, watching everything with an expression of mild curiosity, as if he were a spectator rather than the patient. "Hello," he said to me as I approached to begin my initial assessment, his voice pleasant and cultured. "You must be the nurse. I apologize for the inconvenience. I know you must be busy." It was such an unexpectedly polite greeting that I was momentarily taken aback. "I'm Temperance," I said, pulling on gloves. "We're going to take care of you, Ezekiel. Can you tell me what happened tonight?" He smiled, a gentle, almost sad expression. "I had to let something out," he said simply. "It's been building up for too long. The pressure becomes unbearable if I don't release it." I began carefully removing the temporary bandages to assess his injuries. What I found made my stomach turn, not because of the severity, I've seen much worse trauma, but because of the precision. The cuts on his arms weren't the chaotic, desperate slashes typically seen in self-harm cases. They were deliberate, methodical, almost surgical in their accuracy. Each cut was exactly parallel to the others, spaced with mathematical precision, varying in depth in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. "Ezekiel, did you do this to yourself?" I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "But please understand, I'm not trying to die. Death would be counterproductive. I'm trying to stay alive. This is how I stay alive." Before I could ask what he meant, Dr. Patricia Reeves arrived to examine him. She was our head attending physician that night, experienced and unflappable. But even she paused when she saw the pattern of injuries. We worked together to clean and assess each wound. Most were superficial, requiring only cleaning and butterfly closures, but several of the deeper ones would need sutures. "Ezekiel," Dr. Reeves said as she prepared to begin stitching, "I need to ask you some questions. Have you hurt yourself like this before?" "Many times," he answered calmly. "Since I was 17. Always in the same pattern, always for the same reason." "And what reason is that?" He was quiet for a moment, watching as she began to suture one of the deeper cuts. He showed no reaction to the pain, didn't even flinch as the needle went through his skin. "Have you ever felt like there's something inside you that doesn't belong there?" he finally asked. "Something foreign, alien, that's slowly taking over?" "The only way to keep it contained is to let a little out at a time, like a pressure valve. If I don't, it will consume me entirely." Dr. Reeves exchanged a glance with me. This kind of delusion wasn't uncommon in certain psychiatric conditions. "Ezekiel, have you been diagnosed with any mental health conditions? Are you taking any medications?" "I've been to 13 psychiatrists over the years," he said with a slight laugh. "They've diagnosed me with everything from schizophrenia to delusional disorder to body dysmorphic disorder. I've been on every antipsychotic, mood stabilizer, and antidepressant you can name. None of them worked because none of them understood the actual problem." "And what is the actual problem?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my professional skepticism. He looked directly at me then, and I noticed his eyes were an unusual amber color, almost golden in the harsh hospital lighting. "The problem is that I'm infected with something that medicine doesn't recognize. Something that grows stronger every day that feeds on my body and mind from the inside. the only way to weaken it is to release it through blood. Every cut is a calculated evacuation, a strategic bloodletting to maintain the balance. We continued treating his wounds, and I noticed something odd. Despite the amount of blood loss suggested by his bandages and clothes, his vital signs were surprisingly stable. His blood pressure was normal, his pulse steady. When we drew blood for testing, it seemed unusually dark, almost black in the collection tubes, though the lab results came back normal. As per protocol with self-harm cases, we called for a psychiatric consultation. While we waited, security was posted outside his room, standard procedure to ensure patient safety. The security guard that night was Bartholomew, a gentle giant of a man who'd been with the hospital for 20 years. He was usually assigned to the ER because of his calming presence and ability to de-escalate tense situations. "Keep an eye on him, Bartholomew," Dr. Reeves instructed. "He seems calm now, but that can change quickly with psychiatric patients." About an hour after we'd finished suturing his wounds, I was at the nurse's station catching up on charts when Bartholomew called out, "Nurse Temperance, you need to see this." I rushed to Ezekiel's room to find him sitting up in bed, calmly and methodically removing his sutures with his fingernails. Blood was running down his arms, but his expression remained serene, focused. He wasn't doing it frantically or violently. Each movement was deliberate, careful, as if he were performing a necessary task. "Ezekiel, stop!" I rushed to him, grabbing his hands. "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry," he said, not resisting as I held his wrists. "But you closed them too soon. There's still more that needs to come out. Can't you feel it? The room is getting heavier. The air is thickening. If I don't let more out, something terrible will happen." We had to restrain him then, using soft restraints to prevent him from further injuring himself. I hated doing it. Restraints should always be a last resort. But we had no choice. We resutured his wounds, this time with him restrained, and added additional psychiatric medications to his treatment plan. The psychiatrist, Dr. Jennifer Holbrook, arrived around 2 a.m. She spent an hour with Ezekiel, evaluating his mental state. When she emerged, she looked troubled. "He's displaying symptoms consistent with several conditions," she told us, "but there's something unusual about his presentation. His delusions are remarkably consistent and detailed. He's created an entire internal mythology about this infection he believes he has. He can describe it in vivid detail, how it feels, how it moves through his body, how the bloodletting weakens it." "So, what's the diagnosis?" Dr. Reeves asked. "Provisionally, I'm diagnosing delusional disorder with somatic type, but I want to keep him for extended observation. There's something about his case that doesn't quite fit the typical pattern. He's too organized, too methodical. Most patients with these types of delusions show other signs of disorganized thinking, but Ezekiel is remarkably coherent except for this specific, fixed belief." Around 4 a.m., things took a disturbing turn. I was checking on Ezekiel, adjusting his IV when he suddenly spoke. "It's happening," he said, his voice tight with fear. "I couldn't release enough. It's growing stronger. You need to leave the room, now." "Ezekiel, you're safe." Nothing is going to happen. That's when I noticed it. The skin on his arms, where we had sutured the wounds, was moving. Not the normal movement of muscle and tissue, but something underneath, rippling like water, creating small waves under his skin. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought I was imagining it. But then the movement became more pronounced, more deliberate. "What is that?" I whispered, unable to hide my shock. "I told you," Ezekiel said, tears now streaming down his face. "I tried to warn you. When I don't let enough out, it gets stronger. It starts to take control." I called for Dr. Reeves immediately. By the time she arrived, the movement under Ezekiel's skin had spread to his chest and neck. It looked like something was crawling beneath his skin, creating ridges and valleys that shifted and moved with purpose. Dr. Reeves examined him, her face growing increasingly concerned. "This could be fasciculation," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Involuntary muscle contractions. We need to run more tests, CT scan, MRI, comprehensive blood panels." But before we could move him for testing, Ezekiel's existing wounds, the ones we had just resutured, began to open on their own. Not tearing or ripping, but opening cleanly, as if the sutures were dissolving. Blood began to flow from them, but it wasn't normal blood. It was thick, viscous, and had an iridescent quality that made it seem to shimmer under the fluorescent lights. Bartholomew, who had been standing guard, took a step back. "That ain't natural," he said, his usual calm demeanor shaken. "I've seen a lot in 20 years, but that ain't natural." We tried to control the bleeding, but our efforts seemed futile. The blood wouldn't clot normally, and fresh wounds kept appearing on Ezekiel's body without any external cause. They would manifest as thin red lines that would gradually deepen and open, following the same precise pattern as his self-inflicted injuries. "Please," Ezekiel begged, "let me do it myself. I know how to control it. I know the right places, the right depths. If it happens on its own, people get hurt." "What do you mean, people get hurt?" Dr. Reeves asked. "It's happened before. When I was in the psychiatric hospital in Hartford, they wouldn't let me manage it, and it found another way out. 3 staff members ended up in the ICU with unexplained hemorrhages. The official report blamed a contaminated batch of heparin, but I knew the truth. It had jumped to them, looking for a way out. We all exchanged glances. This was clearly part of his delusion, but the movement under his skin and the spontaneous wounds were undeniably real. Dr. Reeves made the decision to sedate him, hoping that would calm whatever physiological process was occurring. The sedation worked initially. Ezekiel fell into a deep sleep, and the movement under his skin subsided. The spontaneous bleeding stopped. We took the opportunity to run every test we could think of. The results were baffling. His blood showed unusual protein markers that couldn't be identified. The CT scan revealed what looked like a network of thin, thread-like structures throughout his body that didn't correspond to any known anatomical feature. The radiologist suggested they might be artifacts from the imaging process, but they appeared too consistent, too organized to be random errors. While Ezekiel slept, I researched his medical history. What I found was deeply disturbing. He had been admitted to emergency rooms across New England 47 times in the past 15 years, always for self-inflicted injuries, always with the same story about needing to release something. But more troubling were the incident reports from various psychiatric facilities where he had been held. At each facility, there had been unexplained medical events during his stay. Staff members developing sudden, severe anemia. Other patients experiencing spontaneous nosebleeds. One facility had to close an entire ward after multiple people developed what was described as idiopathic hemorrhagic syndrome, unexplained bleeding from multiple sites. Each incident occurred when Ezekiel was prevented from his self-harm behaviors for extended periods. I was reading these reports when Bartholomew suddenly appeared at the nurse's station, his face pale. "Nurse Temperance," he said, his voice shaking. "Something's wrong with me." He held out his arms. Small cuts had appeared on his skin, in the exact same pattern as Ezekiel's injuries. As I watched in horror, they deepened, blood beginning to flow. "I was just standing there, watching him sleep," Bartholomew said, "and I felt this pressure building inside me. Then these appeared. We immediately moved Bartholomew to another examination room. Dr. Reeves was called, and she looked between Bartholomew's wounds and Ezekiel's with growing alarm. "This is impossible," she said. "Wounds don't just spontaneously appear, and they certainly don't transfer between people." But the evidence was undeniable. Over the next hour, 3 more staff members who had been in close contact with Ezekiel developed similar symptoms. First, they reported a feeling of internal pressure, like something pushing against their skin from the inside. Then the cuts would appear, always in the same pattern, always deepening at the same rate. We put the entire ER on lockdown, calling in the infection control team and hazmat units. But every test for pathogens came back negative. Whatever was happening, it didn't follow any known pattern of disease transmission. The CDC was contacted, and they sent a rapid response team, but they were as baffled as we were. Ezekiel woke up 12 hours after we had sedated him. By then, 7 staff members had developed the mysterious wounds. He looked around at the chaos, the hazmat suits, the CDC personnel, the frightened faces, and simply said, "I tried to warn you. It needs a way out. If you don't give it one, it makes its own." The CDC team interviewed him extensively. He was cooperative, even helpful, explaining his condition in detail. According to Ezekiel, he had been infected with something during a trip to Eastern Europe when he was 17. Not a disease in the conventional sense, but something older, something that existed in the spaces between what medicine understood. "It feeds on life force," he explained to the lead CDC investigator. "It grows by consuming its host from within. The only way to slow it down is to release it regularly through bloodletting. But if you prevent that release, it builds up pressure and finds other ways out, including jumping to nearby hosts." It sounded insane, like something out of a horror movie. But we had 7 staff members with unexplained wounds that perfectly matched Ezekiel's, and no medical explanation for what was happening. The CDC team made a controversial decision. They allowed Ezekiel to perform his treatment on himself under medical supervision. Using a sterile scalpel, he made precise incisions on his arms, following the same pattern we had seen before. As the blood flowed, that strange, iridescent blood, something remarkable happened. The wounds on the affected staff members began to heal spontaneously. Within an hour, they had completely closed, leaving only faint scars. "It's returning to its primary host," Ezekiel explained. "I'm its chosen vessel. It only spreads to others when it can't maintain balance in me." The CDC took samples of everything: blood, tissue, even air samples from around Ezekiel. They've never publicly released their findings. Officially, the incident was classified as a case of mass psychogenic illness, a shared delusion that somehow caused psychosomatic wounds. But those of us who were there knew better. Ezekiel was transferred to a specialized facility that the CDC wouldn't name. Before he left, he spoke to me one last time. "I'm not crazy, Temperance," he said. "I wish I were. Being crazy would be so much easier than being a cage for something that shouldn't exist. Every day is a negotiation, a careful balance between feeding it and starving it, between letting it grow and letting it out." "What is it?" I asked. "What's really inside you?" He smiled sadly. "I don't know. Maybe it's a parasite from someplace science hasn't discovered yet. Maybe it's something that's always been here, hiding in the margins of human experience. Or maybe it's exactly what the old stories warned about, the things that possess us, that hollow us out from within, that turn us into vessels for their hunger. Do you think you'll ever be free of it?" "No," he said simply. "We've become symbiotic now. It needs me to exist in this world, and I need it to, I don't know exactly, to be complete, maybe." I can't remember what I was like before it, whether I was whole or if I was always meant to be a container for something else. But I know that if I died, it wouldn't die with me. It would just find new hosts, probably many of them. So I keep going, keep bleeding, keep maintaining the balance. That was 2 years ago. I've tried to follow up on Ezekiel's case, but I hit walls everywhere. The facility he was transferred to doesn't officially exist. The CDC report is classified. Even the medical records from our hospital have been sealed. It's as if the entire incident has been erased from official history. But I know what I saw. I know that Bartholomew still has scars on his arms in that precise pattern, scars that sometimes ache for no reason. I know that several of us who were there that night still have nightmares about things moving under our skin. And I know that sometimes, when the ER is busy and the pressure builds up inside me from the stress and the trauma of the job, I feel an almost irresistible urge to make small, precise cuts on my arms, to let something out before it builds up too much. I've resisted so far, but the urge grows stronger every day. Dr. Reeves left medicine entirely 6 months after the incident. She's teaching high school biology now in a small town in Vermont. She sent me a letter, once that said simply, "There are things medicine isn't equipped to handle. Things that exist outside our understanding. I'd rather teach teenagers about mitosis than face those things again." The other staff members who were affected have all moved on, scattered to different hospitals, different cities, some to different careers entirely. But I've kept track of them. 3 have been treated for self-harm behaviors since the incident. 2 have been diagnosed with delusional disorders remarkably similar to Ezekiel's. 1 disappeared entirely, leaving only a note that said, "It's growing." I need to find him. I still work in the ER. Every patient who comes in with self-inflicted wounds makes me think of Ezekiel. Most are struggling with mental health issues I can understand and help treat. But occasionally, very occasionally, I see something in their eyes. A recognition. A shared understanding of something that shouldn't exist, but does. Last month, a young woman came in with precise, parallel cuts on her arms. When I was treating her, she grabbed my wrist and whispered, "He said you'd understand. He said you saw it too." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, discharged against medical advice, leaving only a pattern of blood on the sheets that looked disturbingly familiar. I've started researching on my own, digging into medical histories, folklore, and accounts that mainstream medicine dismisses. I've found patterns, stories that echo Ezekiel's from different times and places, medieval accounts of bloodletting to release evil spirits, Victorian medical journals describing patients with wandering infections that would spread through hospitals, modern cases buried in bureaucracy and classification of unexplained hemorrhagic events in psychiatric facilities. There's a network of us now, healthcare workers who've encountered cases like Ezekiel's. We share information carefully, anonymously, knowing that official channels would dismiss us as delusional. We've identified at least 12 patients across the country with similar conditions, all managing their infections through controlled self-harm, all telling variations of the same story about something inside them that needs to be released. Some of my colleagues think it's a new disease, something evolved or engineered that medicine hasn't caught up to yet. Others believe it's psychological, a manifestation of trauma so severe it becomes physically real. A few, usually after a few drinks and in hushed voices, wonder if Ezekiel was right. If these are things that have always existed alongside humanity, parasites of consciousness that we've only recently started to recognize. I don't know what I believe, but I know that every time I draw blood from a patient now, I look for that iridescent quality. Every time someone comes in with unexplained wounds, I check for patterns. And every night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I check my own skin for signs of movement, for evidence that what touched us that night in the ER might have left more than just scars. Ezekiel sent me a letter once, forwarded through so many intermediaries I have no idea where he actually is. It contained just one line. The balance is harder to maintain when you're alone. Find others who understand, or it will find you. I've kept that letter. Sometimes I read it when the pressure builds up inside me, when the stress of the job becomes almost unbearable, when I find myself holding a scalpel a little too long, contemplating the relief that might come from just one small, precise cut. So far, I've resisted, but I understand now what Ezekiel meant about negotiation, about balance, about the careful dance between control and release. Because here's what truly haunts me. What if we all carry something like this inside us? What if mental illness, self-harm, the inexplicable behaviors we see in the ER every day are just different manifestations of things trying to get out? What if Ezekiel wasn't special, wasn't uniquely infected, but was just the only one honest enough to acknowledge what's inside all of us? These are the thoughts that keep me awake during my night shifts, that make me question every patient, every diagnosis, every assumption about what's real and what's delusion. Because once you've seen someone's wounds open on their own, once you've watched something move under human skin with purpose and intelligence, once you've felt unexplained cuts appear on your own body, you can never again be certain about the boundaries between mind and body, between self and other, between what's inside us and what's trying to get out. I still work my shifts, still treat my patients, still maintain the facade of normalcy, but I'm always watching, always alert for signs of something more than medical textbooks can explain. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the ER is momentarily still, and I'm alone with my thoughts, I swear and said, I don't know why I do it. It's like something else takes over, like my hands aren't my own. I told her what I was supposed to tell her about coping mechanisms and mental health resources and the help available to her. But inside, I wondered, what if she's right? What if none of our hands are truly our own? What if we're all just vessels for things we don't understand? Things that use our bodies to interact with a world they couldn't otherwise touch. Bartholomew retired early last year. On his last day, he pulled me aside and showed me his arms. The scars from that night had changed, forming new patterns, symbols almost, that neither of us recognized. It's still there, he said quietly. Whatever touched us that night, I can feel it sometimes moving just under the surface, like it's waiting. Waiting for what? I asked. He shrugged, but his eyes were haunted. Maybe for the right moment. Maybe for more like Ezekiel. Maybe for all of us to finally understand what we really are. Not individuals, but containers. Hosts for things that have always been here, using us, living through us, waiting for their chance to fully emerge. That's the thought I can't shake, the possibility that keeps me vigilant and terrified in equal measure. Because if Ezekiel was right, if what happened to him could happen to any of us, if we're all potential vessels for something that exists outside our understanding, then every patient who comes through our doors might be carrying something more than disease or injury. They might be carrying proof that everything we think we know about human bodies, about consciousness, about the nature of self, is incomplete at best and dangerously wrong at worst. I've started keeping a journal, documenting every unusual case, every unexplained symptom, every patient who speaks of pressure building inside them. Maybe I'm becoming paranoid, seeing patterns where none exist. Or maybe I'm finally seeing what was always there, hidden in plain sight among the routine traumas, and treatable conditions. Sometimes I dream about Ezekiel, about the thing moving under his skin, about the blood that seemed to shimmer with its own light. In these dreams, he tells me it's spreading, that what started with him is now in dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of people. That soon, everyone will understand what it means to be a container for something else's existence. I wake from these dreams with my arms aching, with thin red lines on my skin that fade by morning. I tell myself they're psychosomatic, that I'm scratching myself in my sleep. But deep down, I know better. Deep down, I know that what touched us that night in the ER left its mark, and that mark is spreading, slowly but inevitably, like ink through water, like infection through blood, like something ancient and patient finally finding its way into the modern world. The emergency room is different now. Every shift brings the possibility of another Ezekiel, another reminder that human bodies are more mysterious and terrifying than any medical textbook admits. We treat what we can see, what we can understand, what fits into our neat diagnostic categories. But underneath it all, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, something else is moving, growing, waiting for its moment to emerge. And sometimes when I'm suturing a wound or drawing blood, or simply standing in the fluorescent brightness of the ER, I feel it inside me too. That presence, that pressure, that thing that Ezekiel carried and that touched all of us who tried to treat him. It's patient, whatever it is. It can wait years, decades maybe, for the right moment to fully manifest. But I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that one day I'll be the patient, not the nurse. One day, I'll be the one with precise, parallel cuts on my arms, trying to explain to skeptical medical staff that I'm not trying to hurt myself, I'm trying to save everyone else. One day, the thing that Ezekiel carried, that touched us all that night, will demand its release. And when that day comes, I can only hope that someone believes me, that someone understands what I've learned, that some patients aren't sick in any way medicine recognizes. They're carrying something else, something that uses our bodies as doors between worlds, something that requires blood as payment for keeping those doors only partially open. Until then, I work my shifts. I treat my patients, I maintain the balance, and I watch for signs of Ezekiel's legacy spreading through the medical system. One mysterious case at a time, one unexplained wound at a time, one drop of iridescent blood at a time. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Maintain the balance between what we understand and what we fear, between what medicine can explain and what exists beyond explanation, between being healers and being hosts to something that may, one day, refuse to be contained any longer. My name is Constance, and I've spent the last 11 years as an emergency room nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Burlington, Vermont. In all my years of nursing, I've cared for thousands of patients, but there's one who still makes me check the locks on my doors at night. This happened 3 years ago during a particularly harsh winter, and I haven't been able to work isolation duty since. The patient's name was Obadiah, and he was brought to our ER on a January night when the temperature outside was well below zero. The paramedics who brought him in were visibly shaken, which immediately put me on alert. These were experienced EMTs who'd seen everything from gruesome accidents to severe psychiatric episodes, but something about this patient had disturbed them. We found him in an abandoned building on Pine Street, one of them told me as they wheeled him in. Someone called 911 saying they heard screaming, but when we got there, he was just sitting in the middle of an empty room, completely calm, surrounded by dead animals. Dead animals, I repeated, already pulling on protective equipment. Rats, birds, a cat, all arranged in a circle around him. All dead for at least a few days from what we could tell. He was just sitting there in the center talking to them like they were alive. Obadiah appeared to be in his 50s, with gray hair and pale skin that had an almost translucent quality. His eyes were what struck me most. They were a very light blue, so light they almost seemed colorless, and he rarely blinked. He was wearing multiple layers of clothing, all filthy and torn, typical of someone who'd been living on the streets. "Hello, Obadiah," I said as we transferred him to an examination bed. "I'm Constance. How are you feeling tonight?" He turned those pale eyes to me and smiled. "The others don't like the cold," he said, his voice surprisingly clear and articulate. "They stay closer when it's warm. But you keep it warm here, don't you? They'll like that." "Who are the others, Obadiah?" "The ones who travel with me. They're always here, just harder to see sometimes. But in warm places, in close spaces, they become more visible. You'll see them soon enough." I made notes about possible psychiatric issues while beginning my initial assessment. His vital signs were surprisingly normal for someone who'd been exposed to extreme cold. No signs of frostbite, hypothermia, or injury, but there was an odd smell around him, not just the typical odor of someone who hadn't bathed, but something else, sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit. Our supervising nurse that night was Cordelia, a veteran nurse who'd been at Mercy General for 25 years. She took one look at Obadiah and immediately ordered full isolation protocol. "Something's not right," she said quietly. "I've seen every kind of patient come through here. And this one, put him in the negative pressure room. Full PPE for anyone who goes in." The negative pressure isolation room was typically reserved for patients with serious infectious diseases. It seemed like overkill for a potentially psychiatric patient, but I'd learned to trust Cordelia's instincts. We moved Obadiah to the isolation room, a small space with specialized ventilation that kept air from flowing out into the rest of the hospital. As I helped him settle into the room, Obadiah remained eerily calm. He sat on the bed, hands folded in his lap, those pale eyes tracking my every movement. "It's nice in here," he said, "contained. They prefer contained spaces, makes it easier for them to concentrate their presence. Obadiah, I need to ask you some questions for our records. Do you have any medical conditions we should know about? Are you taking any medications?" "I haven't needed medicine for years," he replied. "They take care of me. They remove what makes me sick, consume it before it can harm me. In return, I give them warmth, shelter, transportation. Can you tell me more about them?" He tilted his head, studying me with those unblinking eyes. "You really can't see them yet?" "They're all around us. On the walls, in the air, clustered in the corners. This room is already full of them. They came with me and now they're exploring their new environment." I looked around the sterile isolation room, but saw nothing unusual. Just white walls, medical equipment, the standard fixtures of a hospital room. But as I was about to respond, I noticed something odd. The temperature display on the wall showed the room was at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but it felt much warmer, almost stifling. Over the next few hours, we ran standard tests: blood work, chest x-ray, psychological evaluation. The psychiatrist, Dr. Mills, spent 40 minutes with Obadiah and came out looking puzzled. "He's not presenting with typical delusions," he told us. "His thoughts are organized, he's oriented to person, place, and time. But he has this fixed belief about being, accompanied by invisible entities. He describes them in remarkable detail, their behavior, their needs, their biology even." "What kind of details?" Cordelia asked. "He says they're microscopic individually but can cluster together to become visible. That they feed on biological decay and negative energy. that they've been symbiotic with humans for thousands of years, but only certain people can host them successfully. It's elaborate and consistent, more like someone describing actual observations than delusions. The blood work came back with abnormalities that had the lab calling to confirm they'd run the tests correctly. Obadiah's white blood cell count was extremely high, but not in a pattern consistent with any known infection or disease. More disturbing, the lab tech said that when they'd examined his blood under a microscope, they'd seen unusual movement. Not just the normal movement of blood cells, but something else. Something they couldn't identify. It was around 2 a.m. when things started to get strange. I was doing hourly checks on Obadiah, entering the isolation room in full PPE as Cordelia had ordered. The room was even warmer than before, and there was a humidity to the air that shouldn't have been possible with the hospital's ventilation system. Obadiah was sitting exactly as I'd left him an hour earlier, hands folded, staring at the wall. But the wall he was staring at had changed. There were small dark spots on it, like mold or mildew, spreading in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. "What is that?" I asked, moving closer to examine the spots. "They're making themselves comfortable," Obadiah said calmly. "They always mark their territory first. It helps them establish boundaries, understand the space. Don't worry, they won't harm the building. They're very considerate guests." I called maintenance immediately. The spots shouldn't have been possible. The isolation room was cleaned with industrial disinfectants between every patient. But when maintenance arrived and tried to clean the spots, they couldn't be removed. They weren't on the surface of the wall but seemed to be underneath the paint, as if growing from within. Cordelia came to see for herself. She stood in the doorway of the isolation room, studying the patterns on the wall. "In 25 years, I've never seen anything like this," she said. "We need to contact infection control." But before we could make the call, the spots began to move. Not spreading, but actually moving, shifting position on the wall like living things. They formed patterns, spirals, circles, shapes that seemed almost like writing. Obadiah watched with what looked like paternal pride. "They're trying to communicate with you," he said. "They recognize that you're caring for their host. They're expressing gratitude." The infection control team arrived within an hour, taking samples of the spots, the air, everything they could test. But their equipment started malfunctioning almost immediately. Digital thermometers gave impossible readings. Air quality monitors showed the presence of particles that didn't match any known substances. One team member's protective suit developed tears that appeared spontaneously, as if something had eaten through the material. By 4 a.m., the entire isolation room was covered in the dark spots. They were on the walls, the ceiling, creeping across the floor. The observation window had fogged over from the inside, and when we tried to wipe it clean, the condensation immediately returned. "We need to move him," the infection control supervisor said. "This room is compromised." But when we tried to enter the room to transfer Obadiah, we found the door wouldn't open properly. It would open a few inches, then meet resistance, as if something was pushing back from inside. Through the gap, we could see Obadiah still sitting calmly on the bed, but the air around him seemed thick, almost solid, shimmering with heat distortion. "Let them adjust," Obadiah called out. "They're not used to being disturbed. Give them a moment to recognize you mean no harm." After several minutes, the resistance eased, and we were able to enter. But the sensation inside the room was overwhelming. The air felt alive, pressing against our skin even through protective equipment. There was a sound, too, not quite audible, more like a vibration you could feel in your bones, a constant humming that made it hard to think clearly. We managed to transfer Obadiah to a different isolation room, but within hours the same phenomena began occurring there. The spots appeared faster this time, spreading across the surfaces like accelerated footage of bacterial growth. The temperature spiked, equipment malfunctioned, and that sense of presence, of being watched by countless invisible eyes, grew stronger. Cordelia pulled me aside during my break. "Constance, I've seen things in this hospital that don't have easy explanations, but this is different. Whatever's happening with that patient, it's beyond medical. We need to consider that he might be telling the truth." "You mean about the entities?" She nodded grimly. "I know how it sounds, but we can't explain what's happening through any conventional means. And it's escalating." She was right about the escalation. By morning, the phenomena had spread beyond the isolation room. The spots appeared in the hallway outside. Nurses reported feeling watched. Several staff members developed unexplained rashes that looked like tiny bite marks. The electronic medical record system kept glitching, displaying Obadiah's file randomly on different computers throughout the hospital. I was assigned to continue monitoring him, despite my growing unease. Each time I entered his room, the presence felt stronger, and I began to see things, not clearly, but in my peripheral vision. Movement where there shouldn't be any. Shadows that didn't match any object. Shapes that seemed to cluster around Obadiah like a living cloud. During one check, Obadiah spoke to me more directly than before. "You can see them now, can't you, Constance? They've decided they like you. That's rare. They're very particular about who they reveal themselves to." "What are they?" I asked, abandoning professional skepticism. "What do they want?" "They're old," he said. "Older than humans. We're just their latest hosts. They've lived with us so long that we've evolved together. Most people carry a few without knowing it. But some of us, like me, can carry colonies, entire civilizations of them." "Are they dangerous?" He smiled, that eerily calm smile. "Only if threatened. Or, if their host is harmed, they're very protective. Would you like to see what happens when they feel their host is in danger?" Before I could respond, he picked up a plastic fork from his meal tray and pressed it against his arm. Not hard enough to break the skin, but with clear intent. Immediately, the air in the room changed. The spots on the walls began to pulse. The temperature spiked so suddenly that the fire alarm triggered. And I saw them, really saw them, for the first time. They were everywhere. Tiny things, individually almost invisible, but grouped together in writhing masses that coated every surface. They moved with purpose, flowing like liquid but with obvious intelligence. And they were angry. The ones nearest to me began moving in my direction, and I felt a burning sensation on my exposed skin. "Stop!" Obadiah commanded, dropping the fork. "She's not a threat. She's helping." The burning stopped immediately. The masses of entities retreated, resuming their previous positions. But I had seen them, and that image is burned into my memory forever. Hospital administration was in crisis mode. They couldn't explain what was happening, couldn't contain it, couldn't even properly document it because any equipment brought near Obadiah's room would malfunction. They brought in specialists from the CDC, but their investigation was hampered by the same issues. On the third night of Obadiah's stay, things reached a breaking point. The entities had spread throughout the entire emergency department. Staff were calling in sick with mysterious symptoms. Patients in other rooms were complaining about feeling things crawling on them. The spots had appeared on medical equipment, walls, even on the windows facing outside. Cordelia made an executive decision. "We're discharging him," she announced. "This is beyond our ability to manage." But when we went to discharge Obadiah, we found him in conversation with someone who wasn't there, or at least wasn't visible to us. He was nodding, responding to unheard questions, occasionally gesturing as if to introduce us. "They want to know if they can establish a colony here," he said to us. "They like the warmth, the constant flow of biological material. Hospitals are ideal environments for them. They could help, They consume disease, decay, negative energy. They could make this a place of accelerated healing." "We need you to leave," Cordelia said firmly. "Now." Obadiah looked sad but nodded. "They understand. We'll go. But Constance," he turned to me, "they've marked you. Not in a bad way. You're under their protection now. If you're ever in danger, they'll know." As he prepared to leave, the spots on the walls began to fade. The temperature normalized. Equipment started functioning again. It was as if the entities were being recalled, pulled back to their host. Within an hour of his discharge, almost all traces of the phenomena had disappeared. Almost all. Because I still carry marks from that encounter. Small spots on my skin that doctors can't explain. A sensitivity to temperature changes that I never had before. And sometimes, in warm, enclosed spaces, I can feel them. The entities that Obadiah carried, or maybe their relatives, watching me, following me, keeping their promise of protection. Cordelia retired 6 months after Obadiah's visit. She told me that in all her years of nursing, he was the only patient who made her question the nature of reality itself. "We like to think medicine understands the human body," she said. "But what if we're not just human? What if we're ecosystems, hosts to things we can't see or measure?" The hospital never officially documented the full extent of what happened during those 3 days. The records show only that a homeless man was treated for exposure and released. But those of us who were there know better. We know that something beyond medical understanding walked into our ER that winter night, showed us a glimpse of a hidden world that exists alongside our own, and then walked back out into the cold. I still work at Mercy General, but I can't do isolation duty anymore. The rooms are too warm, too enclosed. They remind me too much of that night, of the feeling of being surrounded by invisible life, of being watched by countless eyes I couldn't see. Other nurses have noticed my aversion, but I can't explain it to them. How do you tell someone that you're afraid of empty rooms because you know they're never really empty? Sometimes, during particularly cold nights, I think about Obadiah, wondering where he is, where those entities guided him next. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the hospital late at night, I feel them around me. Not the full colony that Obadiah carried, but a few stragglers, the ones he said had marked me. They've never harmed me. If anything, I've been remarkably healthy since that encounter, never getting sick despite constant exposure to pathogens in the ER. It's as if something is protecting me, consuming threats before they can affect me. But the knowledge that they're there, that I'm never truly alone, that I'm carrying passengers I can't see or control, that's a weight I'll bear for the rest of my life. Because once you know that we're not alone, not just in the universe but in our own bodies, in our own spaces, you can never unknown it. Once you've seen the invisible world that exists parallel to ours, you realize that everything we think we understand about life, about consciousness, about the nature of existence itself is incomplete. Obadiah opened a door that night, showed us something we weren't meant to see, and even though that door closed when he left, cracks remain. Cracks through which things slip through. Things that watch, wait, and sometimes protect. That's why I still work nights, why I keep busy, why I never let myself sit still for too long in warm, quiet places. Because in the stillness, in the warmth, I can feel them gathering, the entities that have made me part of their extended network. And I'm terrified that one day, like Obadiah, I'll stop being afraid and start being grateful for their presence. That I'll stop being just Constance the nurse and become another host, another carrier, another link in a chain that connects all of us in ways we're not supposed to know about. My name is Patience, and I've been an emergency room nurse at Sacred Heart Medical Center in Spokane, Washington for 8 years. I've always prided myself on staying calm under pressure, on being the steady presence that patients need during their worst moments. But there was one patient who shattered that composure, who made me question everything I thought I knew about sleep, consciousness, and what happens when we close our eyes at night. His name was Zebedee, and he was brought to our ER at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I remember the exact time because that's when everything in my orderly night shift went completely sideways. The paramedics rushed him in with multiple injuries, a broken wrist, lacerations on his feet, bruising across his torso, and a head wound that was bleeding profusely. Found him on the roof of a parking garage downtown, the lead paramedic told me as we transferred him to a trauma bed. Security footage shows him climbing up the exterior of the building. 7 stories, barehanded, in his pajamas. He was asleep the whole time. Asleep? I repeated, already beginning my assessment. You mean he was intoxicated? No, literally asleep. Eyes closed, not responding to security guards shouting at him. He only woke up when he reached the roof and walked into an HVAC unit. That's how he got the head wound. Zebedee was in his early 40s, average build, with prematurely gray hair and hands that showed signs of previous injuries. Old scars, a slightly crooked finger that suggested a past break. He was conscious now, but disoriented, looking around the trauma bay with confusion and growing panic. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What happened? Why am I bleeding?" "You're at Sacred Heart Medical Center," I said, applying pressure to his head wound while checking his pupils for signs of concussion. "You had an accident while sleepwalking. Do you remember anything?" His face went pale. "Not again," he whispered. "Please, not again." Dr. Phineas arrived to examine him. Phineas was our head of emergency medicine, a brilliant but eccentric doctor who had a particular interest in unusual cases. He took one look at Zebedee's injuries and the paramedics' report and immediately ordered a comprehensive workup. "Mr. Zebedee," Phineas said while suturing the head wound, "the paramedics tell us you climbed 7 stories while asleep. That's not typical sleepwalking behavior. How long has this been happening?" Zebedee closed his eyes, and I saw tears squeeze out from under his lids. "Since I was 12. But it's gotten worse over the years, much worse." Over the next hour, as we treated his injuries, Zebedee told us his history. The sleepwalking had started with simple episodes, walking around his bedroom, going to the kitchen. But as he got older, the episodes became more complex and dangerous. He'd wake up miles from home. He'd find evidence that he'd cooked elaborate meals while asleep. Once, he woke up in his car, parked at a rest stop 3 hours away, with no memory of driving there. "I've seen every specialist," he said. "Sleep studies, neurologists, psychiatrists. They all say it's an extreme form of parasomnia, but no one can explain why it's so severe or how I can perform such complex tasks while unconscious." "What about medication?" Phineas asked. "I've tried everything. Benzodiazepines, antidepressants, even antipsychotics. Nothing stops it. Restraints don't work either. I've dislocated my shoulder getting out of medical restraints while asleep. It's like something else takes control of my body when I'm unconscious." We admitted him for observation and further testing. I was assigned to monitor him overnight, which meant staying in or near his room to ensure he didn't have another episode. Hospital policy typically didn't allow for one-on-one observation except in psychiatric cases, but Phineas made an exception given the severity of Zebedee's condition. Around 1 a.m., I was sitting in a chair beside his bed, catching up on charting, when I noticed his breathing pattern change. It became deeper, more rhythmic. His eyes began moving rapidly under his closed lids, REM sleep. I watched carefully, ready to intervene if he showed signs of getting up. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, his eyes opened. But something was wrong. His pupils were completely dilated despite the room lights being on, and his gaze was unfocused, looking through me rather than at me. "Zebedee?" I said softly, not wanting to startle him. He sat up smoothly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His movements were fluid, purposeful, nothing like the clumsy, confused movements typical of sleepwalkers. He stood up, and I placed a gentle hand on his arm to guide him back to bed. The moment I touched him, his head snapped toward me, and what I saw in his eyes made me step back. They were empty, completely devoid of the personality I'd been talking to just hours earlier. But they weren't just blank. There was something else there, something that looked at me with an intelligence that wasn't Zebedee's. He spoke, but his voice was different, flatter, without his usual inflections. "You shouldn't interfere. Important work needs to be done. Zebedee, you're sleepwalking. You need to get back in bed." "Zebedee is sleeping," he said, tilting his head at an unnatural angle. "I am what wakes when he sleeps. And I have tasks to complete." Before I could respond, he moved past me with surprising speed and strength. I called for security immediately, but Zebedee was already out of the room, walking down the hospital corridor with perfect confidence, navigating obstacles without hesitation despite supposedly being asleep. I followed him, along with 2 security guards who'd responded to my call. Zebedee moved through the hospital like he'd worked there for years, taking shortcuts, using staff-only passages. He went straight to the pharmacy storage room, where he stood in front of the locked door, his fingers moving in complex patterns in the air, as if typing on an invisible keyboard. "The code is 7-4-8-2-9-1, quote, he said aloud. That was the actual door code, which he shouldn't have known. The door clicked open, and he walked inside. We found him gathering specific medications, reading labels despite his eyes being unfocused and dilated. He was selecting particular drugs, stimulants, neurological medications, compounds that affected brain chemistry. When security tried to stop him, he evaded them with movements that seemed almost choreographed, as if he knew exactly what they would do before they did it. "Don't hurt him! He's asleep!" I shouted as one guard reached for his taser. Zebedee suddenly stopped, turning to face us. "You want to understand," he said in that flat voice, "but understanding requires experiencing. Would you like to see what Zebedee sees when he sleeps?" He reached out and touched my hand before I could pull away. The moment his skin made contact with mine, I experienced something indescribable. For a split second, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was somewhere else. A vast, dark space filled with geometric patterns that hurt to perceive, with entities that moved in ways that violated physics, with sounds that weren't sounds, but pure information forcing itself into my consciousness. I jerked away, gasping, and found myself back in the pharmacy storage room. Zebedee had collapsed, and his eyes were closed normally now, his breathing returning to regular sleep patterns. The security guards were staring at me. "What just happened?" one of them asked. "You were standing there frozen for like 5 minutes." 5 minutes? It had felt like a second. We carried Zebedee back to his room, and I called Dr. Phineas immediately. When he arrived and reviewed the security footage, his face grew increasingly grave. "Look at this," he said, showing me the video on his tablet. It showed Zebedee navigating the hospital, But in several frames, there were anomalies, shadows that didn't match his body, reflections in windows that showed him in different positions than where he actually was, and most disturbingly, moments where he seemed to be in two places at once, like a double exposure. "That's not possible," I said. "It must be a camera malfunction." "All 12 cameras we reviewed show similar anomalies," Phineas replied. "And look at this," the timestamp jumps. "According to the system, he was in the pharmacy for 30 minutes, but you say it was only 5. Zebedee woke up around 6 a.m. with no memory of the episode. When we told him what had happened, he broke down, crying. "It's getting stronger," he said. "The thing that takes over when I sleep. I can feel it even when I'm awake now, waiting just below the surface." "What is it?" Phineas asked. "You said something else takes control." "What do you mean?" Zebedee was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 12, I had a near-death experience. Drowning accident at a lake. I was underwater for almost 10 minutes before they pulled me out. They managed to resuscitate me, but something came back with me. Something that had been waiting in that space between life and death." "That's not medically possible," Phineas said, but he sounded less certain than usual. "Every time I sleep, I go back to that place," Zebedee continued, "and the thing that saved me or cursed me takes my place here. It uses my body to do things, to accomplish tasks I don't understand. Sometimes I get fragments of memory, images that don't make sense. Complex mathematical equations, blueprints for devices that shouldn't exist, locations of places I've never been." We kept him under observation for 3 more nights. Each night, despite increasing sedation and physical restraints, the sleepwalking episodes occurred, and each time they became more disturbing. On the second night, he somehow picked the locks on his restraints using a paperclip he couldn't have had access to. He was found in the morgue, standing over a recently deceased patient, measuring the body with his hands and muttering numbers in a language our translator app couldn't identify. On the third night, the entire hospital's electrical system experienced fluctuations whenever he entered REM sleep. Lights would dim, computers would restart, and medical equipment would show impossible readings. During his episode that night, he went to the pediatric ward and stood outside the rooms of sleeping children, not entering but observing. His head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "We need to transfer him to a specialized facility," Phineas finally decided. "This is beyond our capabilities." But on the morning of the 4th day, before the transfer could be arranged, something extraordinary happened. I was doing my rounds when I heard shouting from Zebedee's room. I ran in to find him awake but struggling against invisible restraints, his body contorting in impossible ways. "It doesn't want to go back," he screamed. "It's trying to stay awake, trying to keep control." His voice kept changing, sometimes his normal voice, sometimes the flat tone from his sleepwalking episodes, sometimes something else entirely, something that sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. Phineas arrived with several other doctors. We watched in horrified fascination as Zebedee's body seemed to be fighting itself, one hand trying to choke him while the other tried to pull it away. His face cycled through different expressions: terror, calm calculation, rage, and something alien that human faces shouldn't be able to make. "Give him propofol," Phineas ordered. "Maximum dose." As the anesthetic entered his system, Zebedee's struggles intensified. Just before he lost consciousness, he looked directly at me with clear, terrified eyes and said, "Don't let it out. Whatever you do, don't let it fully wake up." He slept for 18 hours straight. When he finally woke, he was different, calmer, but also somehow diminished, like part of him was missing. It's gone, he said quietly, or at least it's sleeping deeper now. But it'll come back. It always comes back. We transferred him to a specialized sleep disorder clinic in Seattle, one equipped to handle extreme parasomnias. But before he left, he gave me a journal he'd been keeping for years, documenting his episodes. Reading it later, I found detailed accounts of his nighttime activities. Complex engineering diagrams, mathematical proofs, maps of cave systems that supposedly didn't exist, and repeated references to something called the waiting room. According to his journal, the waiting room was the place between waking and sleeping, between life and death, where consciousness went when the body shut down. And it wasn't empty. It was full of things that wanted to experience physical existence, things that could only do so by borrowing bodies of the sleeping or dying. The last entry, dated the night before he came to our ER, was chilling. It's almost ready. Soon, it won't need me to be asleep. Soon, it will be strong enough to exist here permanently. I'm going to try to stop it, even if it means never sleeping again. If I fail, if something happens to me, whoever reads this needs to know. We're not alone when we sleep. We're never alone. And sometimes, we don't come back alone. I've kept track of Zebedee since his transfer. The clinic reports that his episodes have decreased but haven't stopped. They've recorded impossible phenomena during his sleep. Objects moving without being touched, electronic interference, and once, security footage of him being in two places simultaneously. But what haunts me most is what I experienced when he touched my hand. That glimpse into whatever place he goes when he sleeps. Because sometimes, now, when I'm on the edge of sleep myself, I feel myself slipping toward that dark space full of watching entities. And I wonder, how many of us bring something back each time we wake up? How many of us are sharing our bodies with things that take control when consciousness fades? The other nurses have noticed I've become obsessive about staying awake during night shifts, that I drink excessive amounts of coffee, and take frequent walks to avoid any chance of dozing off. They don't understand that I'm terrified of what might take control if I sleep here. In this place, where the boundary between states of consciousness seems thinner. Because Zebedee showed me that sleepwalking isn't just about unconscious movement. Sometimes, it's about something else walking in our sleep, using our bodies as vehicles to interact with a world they can't otherwise touch. And once you know that, once you've seen the evidence, every moment of sleep becomes a risk. Every dream a potential doorway for something else to enter. I still work at Sacred Heart, still take night shifts, but I've never been the same. Every patient who comes in with sleep disorders, every case of unusual parasomnia, makes me wonder if they're like Zebedee, carrying something that emerges when consciousness fades. And sometimes in the early morning hours when exhaustion pulls at my eyelids, I remember his warning. Don't let it fully wake up. Because if Zebedee was right, if there really are entities waiting in that space between waking and sleeping, then every one of us is just one deep sleep away from becoming a vessel for something else's agenda. And the scariest part is we'd never know. We'd wake up with no memory, maybe a few unexplained bruises, maybe in a strange place, never realizing that for hours we weren't ourselves at all. That's why I document everything now, why I check security footage obsessively, why I've installed cameras in my own apartment. Because if something is using my body while I sleep, I want to know. I need to know, even if the knowledge terrifies me more than ignorance ever could. My name is Charity, and I've worked as an emergency room nurse at Providence Memorial Hospital in El Paso, Texas, for 9 years. Throughout my career, I've encountered patients with various psychiatric conditions, including dissociative identity disorder. But nothing prepared me for Mordecai, the patient who made me question the very nature of identity and consciousness. He arrived on a humid September evening, brought in by police after being found wandering downtown, disoriented and claiming to be multiple different people. This wasn't unusual in itself. We regularly see patients in psychotic states or with identity confusion. What was unusual was how the officers described his behavior. One minute he's speaking perfect Spanish, claims to be a woman named Maria from Juarez, the officer told me. Next minute he's got a British accent, says he's a professor from Oxford. Then he's a kid, maybe 8 years old, crying for his mother. Each personality knew things they shouldn't know. Maria knew details about a missing person case from 2018. The professor could recite complex mathematical theorems. The kid knew the layout of an elementary school that closed down 20 years ago. Mordecai appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair and distinctive heterochromia, one brown eye, one blue. When I first approached him, he was sitting perfectly still on the examination bed, his posture rigid and formal. "Hello, I'm Charity, your nurse today," I said gently. "Can you tell me your name?" He looked at me with those mismatched eyes, and his expression shifted subtly, not dramatically, but enough that he seemed like a different person. "Mordecai," he said in a soft, measured voice, though that may not mean much. I'm rarely just Mordecai anymore. What do you mean by that? I mean that I'm a crowded house, Nurse Charity. Too many residents, not enough rooms. Sometimes they take turns, sometimes they fight for control, and sometimes... He paused, his face shifting again. Sometimes they all speak at once. I began my initial assessment, checking his vital signs and looking for any signs of injury or intoxication. Everything appeared normal physically, but his demeanor kept changing. One moment he was calm and articulate, the next agitated and speaking in fragments, then suddenly childlike and frightened. Dr. Wilhelmina, our psychiatric consultant, was called immediately. Wilhelmina was one of the most experienced psychiatrists I'd ever worked with, specializing in dissociative disorders and complex trauma cases. She spent 2 hours with Mordecai that first night, and when she emerged, she looked genuinely unsettled. "This doesn't present like typical DID," she told me privately. "The personalities aren't consistent. They're not fixed identities with their own histories and characteristics. It's more like he's channeling different people, complete strangers, with verifiable details about their lives that he couldn't possibly know." "What do you mean, verifiable details?" One personality claimed to be a woman who died in a car accident 3 years ago. Gave her full name, social security number, details about her children. I checked. It's all accurate. Another personality spoke fluent Mandarin and described living in Beijing. Gave an address that corresponds to a real apartment building. It's impossible. We admitted Mordecai for observation and further evaluation. I was assigned to his care, which meant regular check-ins throughout my shift. Each interaction was different, sometimes drastically so. During one check, I encountered an elderly woman's personality who complained about her arthritis and asked about her grandson, Tommy. An hour later, it was a teenage boy who knew every detail about current video games and spoke in modern slang that seemed out of place coming from Mordecai's 30-something body. But the most disturbing encounter came around 2 a.m. I entered his room to find him standing at the window, pressing his palms against the glass. When he turned to look at me, his expression was blank, neutral, in a way that seemed almost inhuman. "Your Charity," he said, but it wasn't a greeting. It was like he was identifying me, cataloging me. "Nurse, 28 years old, lost your father when you were 16. Car accident on Highway 54. You still blame yourself for asking him to pick you up from that party." I felt the blood drain from my face. I had never told anyone at the hospital about my father's death. Certainly never the details. "How do you know that?" "Because Sarah knows," he said, and his expression shifted to one of sympathy. Sarah worked the accident. She was the paramedic who tried to save him. She's here now, in me, and she remembers. She remembers you holding his hand while she worked. You were wearing a blue dress with small white flowers. I had to grab the door frame to steady myself. Every detail was accurate. But Sarah, I knew that name. Sarah Coleman had been the paramedic that night, and she had died 2 years ago from cancer. I knew because I had attended her funeral, wanting to thank her for her kindness that terrible night. "This isn't possible," I whispered. "None of this is possible," Mordecai replied, his voice changing again, becoming his own. "But it's happening anyway. They come to me, Charity. The dead, the living, the lost. They use me to speak, to finish unfinished business, to say things they never got to say. I'm like a telephone between worlds, and I can't hang up." Over the next 3 days, Mordecai's condition became increasingly complex. The personalities multiplied and became more distinct. Security footage showed him having full conversations with empty air, but responding as both sides of the dialogue in different voices, different languages, different mannerisms. Wilhelmina brought in colleagues, specialists in dissociative disorders from across the state. They conducted extensive tests, brain scans, psychological evaluations, hypnosis sessions. The brain scans showed unusual activity, multiple areas lighting up simultaneously in patterns that shouldn't be possible, as if several different consciousness centers were active at once. During one particularly intense episode, Mordecai cycled through 17 different personalities in the span of an hour. Each one had specific, verifiable information. A mechanic who knew the detailed specifications of a rare 1960s car engine. A ballet dancer who could describe specific performances at the Moscow Ballet from the 1980s. A soldier who knew classified details about a military operation in Afghanistan. The most unsettling moment came when Mordecai suddenly looked directly at Wilhelmina and spoke in German, in a voice that made her face go white. Later, she told me it was her deceased mother's voice, with the exact same inflection and pet names her mother had used. He recited a lullaby that Wilhelmina's mother had sung to her as a child, one that had never been written down or recorded. "How is this possible?" I asked Wilhelmina after that session. She was shaking, all her professional composure gone. "I don't know. Everything I know about psychology, about consciousness, says this is impossible. But he knew things only my mother knew, used phrases only she used. Either this is the most elaborate hoax I've ever seen, or we're dealing with something beyond our understanding." On the 4th night, things escalated. I was doing my rounds when I heard shouting from Mordecai's room. I rushed in to find him pressed against the corner of the room, his hands over his ears, tears streaming down his face. "Too many," he was screaming. "Too many voices. They all want to speak at once. I can't hold them all." His voice kept changing mid-sentence, cycling through different personas so quickly it was like listening to a radio rapidly switching between stations. Male voices, female voices, young, old, different languages, all overlapping and competing for control. Then something happened that I'll never forget. Mordecai's body went rigid, and when he spoke again, it was in multiple voices simultaneously. Not one after another, but actually at the same time, creating an impossible harmony of different timbres and languages. The sound was wrong. Shouldn't have been able to come from a single human throat. "We are many," the voices said in unison. "We are the forgotten, the lost, the ones with unfinished stories. He is our conduit, our voice, our last chance to be heard. The lights in the room began to flicker. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I swear I saw them, shadows, shapes, translucent figures surrounding Mordecai, reaching toward him, through him, using him as some sort of gateway. I called for help immediately. By the time Wilhelmina and the medical team arrived, Mordecai had collapsed. He was unconscious but stable. His vital signs normal, except for unusual brain activity that suggested he was in some form of deep REM sleep, despite being unresponsive to stimuli. He remained unconscious for 12 hours. During that time, the strangest things happened around him. Other patients in nearby rooms reported vivid dreams about deceased loved ones. Staff members heard voices they recognized but couldn't place. The hospital's phone system malfunctioned, with calls coming in from disconnected numbers, voices asking for people by name. People we later discovered had died years ago. When Mordecai finally woke, he was different. Calmer, but also somehow more fractured. "They're organized now," he told me. "They've formed a sort of committee. They take turns more politely. But there are so many of them, Charity, hundreds, maybe thousands, all wanting their moment to exist again." "Why you?" I asked. "Why are they coming to you?" He smiled sadly. "I died once, when I was 7, drowned in a public pool. Was dead for 6 minutes before they brought me back. But when I came back, I wasn't alone. I brought a door back with me, one that can't be closed. The dead, the lost, the ones who aren't ready to let go, they see that door, and they walk through." Wilhelmina arranged for Mordecai to be transferred to a specialized research facility that studied anomalous psychological phenomena. But before the transfer, he asked to speak with me privately. "Charity," he said, and I could tell it was really him, the core Mordecai, speaking. "Your father wants you to know something." I stiffened. "Don't. Please let me tell you. He's been trying to reach you, but you're closed off, protected. He wants you to know it wasn't your fault. He was already on that highway, coming to get you before you called. The accident would have happened either way. He loves you, and he needs you to stop carrying that guilt." I broke down crying then, years of suppressed guilt and grief flooding out. Whether it was real or not, whether my father was really speaking through Mordecai or it was all some elaborate delusion, those words gave me a peace I hadn't felt in 12 years. The day Mordecai was transferred, he left me with a warning. "It's spreading," he said. "What happened to me, it's happening to others." People who've had near-death experiences, who've touched that boundary between life and death. We're all doors now, and more things are learning how to walk through. Be careful who you trust, Charity. Sometimes the person you're talking to isn't the only one speaking. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've noticed things. Patients who know things they shouldn't. Colleagues who sometimes speak in voices that aren't quite their own. Moments when I could swear I see shadows that don't match the people casting them. Last week, a new patient came in. A young woman who'd attempted suicide and been resuscitated after 8 minutes of cardiac arrest. When she woke up, she looked at me with recognition I couldn't explain and said, "Mordecai says hello. He says the committee is growing, and they remember you fondly." I've started researching near-death experiences, looking for patterns, for others like Mordecai. What I've found suggests he's not unique. There are reports from around the world of people who came back from death changed, carrying something with them, becoming conduits for voices that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, during quiet night shifts, I think about what Mordecai said about doors that can't be closed. I wonder how many of us are walking around with those doors inside us. How many of us are just one traumatic event away from becoming like him? Crowded houses full of personalities that aren't our own. And sometimes, when I'm very tired and my defenses are down, I hear my father's voice, clear as day, telling me he loves me. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just my mind processing what Mordecai told me. But deep down, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, the door isn't only in people like Mordecai. Maybe we all have those doors, and some of us just haven't learned to hear what's trying to come through. The emergency room feels different now. Every patient could be carrying multiple consciousness. Every conversation could be with someone who isn't really there, or someone who is there but shouldn't be. The boundaries between life and death, between self and other, between one person and many, seem so much thinner than they used to. I still work my shifts, still care for my patients, but I'm always listening now, not just to what they're saying, but to who might be saying it. Because Mordecai taught me that we're never really alone, that consciousness doesn't always end with death, and that sometimes the person you're trying to help is actually a crowd of people, all desperate for one more moment of existence, one more chance to be heard. That's why I've become the nurse who always listens, who never dismisses even the strangest claims, who pays attention when patients say they're hearing voices or feeling like someone else. Because after Mordecai, I know that sometimes they're telling the absolute truth. And sometimes being a good nurse means caring not just for the patient in front of you, but for all the unseen passengers they might be carrying.